Washington correspondent for Der Spiegel magazine. Washington Post this Friday, August 30th, has this story, page A25. East German diplomat defects to Bonn and spy countermove. William Drozdiak writes a story, Dateline Bonn, West Germany, and it says, the West German government, reeling from a major spy scandal, struck a counterblow today by announcing the defection of a senior East German diplomat posted in Buenos Aires. The diplomat, Martin Winkler, 44, was described as one of East Germany's most experienced specialists in Latin American affairs. He had served in Havana as a head of Foreign Ministry's Central American desk before becoming the charge d'affaires in the Buenos Aires embassy in '81, officials here said. Is this the latest round in some give and take between the East German and West German governments dealing with the spy case?
It might be, although I heard a comment on this last night already on CBS News, I think, when Bob Schiefer said that Martin Winkler, at least allegedly, had been a double agent. So it's not such a big catch of the West Germans if he really was, because that would mean that he had just really jumped ship in order not to be discovered by his own people.
Are we
I don't know whether it's true. I mean, I'm sitting here together with you and I'm not familiar with the details back down in Germany right now.
So we look at the USA Today this morning, another story dealing with it. This one is on page 3 and it says, Kohl foes force session of Parliament on spies. It's by Wellington Long, special for USA Today. The dateline is Bonn and it says, West Germany, Parliament will hold a special meeting Tuesday on West Germany's widening spy affair, session forced by opposition Social Democrats pushing for the resignation of Interior Minister Frederick Zimmermann. How big a blow is this to the West German government?
It is a big blow because you have to keep in mind that the West German government over the past few months has been rather shaky. I mean, Mr. Kohl himself doesn't give the impression, but the government itself has been hurt by quite a number of affairs and scandals. One of them, only to mention, was the case of a homosexual, of a general being accused to be homosexual, which almost led to the resignation of Defense Secretary Werner. And now we have the second affair, and well, in some other countries, take for example Japan, when the Japan Airlines Jumbo crashed, the gentleman not particularly in charge of that flight, but of the airline, resigned. It's a matter of etiquette and of behavior. In some countries, people who are officially in charge of an airline, of, in this case, the intelligence community, would resign. But you don't have it here either. So the calls for resignation, as far as the Minister of the Interior is concerned, are understandable, but they will probably not have any consequences.
We're beginning to see articles now talking about how open West Germany is, how open it is for spying, in the sense that the West German society itself is a very open society when you compare it with East Germany, and you're almost inviting spies to come in and find out what they may. Is that a problem or a concern among West Germans?
It is a special problem which is basically due to the geographical location. I mean, there is a constant back and forth between East and West Germany. You don't have any language barrier, you don't have any cultural barrier. So it is very easy, for example, for East German spies to get into West Germany, and also the other way around, as a matter of fact.
As we look at New York Times this morning, James Markham writes a story, page 3 of the New York Times, Spy Scandal in West Germany Widens. Dateline is Bonn, and Mr. Markham writes, a spy scandal took fresh turns today with disclosures that a West German internal security officer had been questioned about a friendship with an East German agent and that an East German diplomat had defected to West Germany. The West German prosecutor's office in Karlsruhe, said that the internal security officer, Reinhard Liebetanz, 48 years old, was detained today and questioned about a 10-year friendship with an East German agent. This isn't the first time this instance, something like this, has happened. Can we anticipate that we are going to see some spies moving back and forth from West Germany to East Germany back to West Germany as a means of covering themselves, pretty much?
Yeah, I'm pretty sure you can expect that. You will have a few more stories like this over the next few weeks or months, I'm pretty sure.
If we move a little further in this story by James Markham, he continues to talk about it, and he brings up the issue of the general and the accusations of homosexuality. In the middle of it here, it says homosexuality issue raised. West German officials in their public comments were careful to avoid any suggestion that Mr. Liebetanz and Mr. Severin might have had a homosexual relationship. Early last year, the West German Military Intelligence Agency provoked a scandal by accusing a West German general of being a homosexual. He was dismissed but was then rehabilitated after the charges could not be proved. However, the tabloid Daily Bild, I believe, had no compunction about raising the issue in its headline on Mr. Severin's disappearance, quote, "First homo agent skips town." Whole issue of how journalists in Europe cover some of these issues. Headline like that, "First homo agent skips town" in a newspaper. You see perhaps some more sensational headlines in some of the European
No, not really. If I just go outdoors here and look at the New York Post, for example, or New York Daily News and some other papers, you'll find the same sort of headlines. You wouldn't find a headline like that, like the one you just quoted from Bild-Zeitung in any serious daily newspaper. I mean, Bild-Zeitung is a tabloid comparable to Daily News or the New York Post. So if you talk about daily newspapers like the New York Times, then you have to compare it with other papers than Bild-Zeitung.
Good morning and welcome to our call-in program. For the next hour, our guest to take a look at headlines on the morning newspaper, and specifically a couple of issues, one of them being the spy case that's unraveling in West Germany, and spies moving back and forth across the East and West German border. Also joining us to talk about some of the jockeying that's going on between the U.S. and the Soviet Union over the Arms Control Summit coming up in Vienna this coming November. Our guest is Lohfeldt. He's a Washington correspondent, as I said, with Der Spiegel magazine. Der Spiegel, that is a weekly news magazine, is that correct?
That's correct.
And would it be safe to say that it's the West German equivalent of our Newsweek Time or U.S.?
That's absolutely correct. Time being the grandfather of all news magazines, so what else can you say?
So Der Spiegel actually follows after Time magazine?
I would say so.
How many people read Der Spiegel? What's your subscribers?
We have a circulation of 1.1 million copies a week. Unfortunately only in German, but still we have a readership of about 5.5 million people. So that means one copy is read by approximately 5 people.
So if it's only printed in German, is it read throughout, safe to say it's read throughout Europe?
Yes, definitely.
Mr. Lohfeldt has been with Der Spiegel magazine since 1960. He's been in Washington for a total of 7 years. Before that, he was in Hamburg, and he served as deputy foreign editor for the magazine, and before that he was a member of the editorial staff as a writer. And he has been covering, as I said, some of the jockeying going on between the United States and the Soviet Union over what's going to be taking place in Geneva at the arms control talks. Also the Walker spy case, which we'll be talking a little bit about this morning, and the spy scandal, and also been doing a few stories about presidential politics and some of the campaigning that's going on between some of the different candidates, obvious candidates, who just might be running for president in 1988. He graduated from college in West Germany. He is married, he has 4 children, and is originally from Hamburg, West Germany. Phone lines are open for viewers in all areas of the country. I'd like you to get out your morning newspaper and kind of look through and see if your paper has any of the articles about any of the stories in which we're talking about today. We're going to be a little bit narrow in what we're talking about and concentrating our conversation in a few areas. So look in your newspaper for some of these stories, and if you find it, give us a call at 202-628-2525. If you live in Eastern and Central time zones, and those of you living in Pacific and Mountain time zones, 202-783-2727. You have been covering or working on stories dealing with U.S. and the USSR preparing for these arms control talks in Vienna. What is some of the jockeying that is going on? Are we seeing some diplomatic gamesmanship?
Well, Carl, number one, I object to describing the summit as an arms control summit. It is a summit between the president of this country and Mr. Gorbachev, and they certainly will have quite a number of other issues to talk about than just arms control. It just so happens that it takes place in Geneva, where the second round or the next round of the arms control talks is going on. But I think it would be very dangerous to just define that summit meeting as an arms control summit, because then we can almost predict, I'm afraid, that it won't have any result whatsoever.
Do you think this is simply a get-acquainted session between Mr. Gorbachev and Mr. Reagan?
It's probably a mixture of that. It's, number one, certainly a get-acquainted session. They will probably sign a few bilateral papers, let's say, regarding airline traffic between Moscow and the United States, or cultural exchange, or the opening of additional consulates. But looking at the statements which have come from the Soviet Union as well as from the United States, one cannot see, at least as of now, any chance for a breakthrough in the arms control negotiations emanating from that summit.
If in fact there won't be a great deal accomplished, why meet? What can be accomplished at one of those meetings?
Well, I think the main accomplishment certainly should be and is for these people to meet. Your former president, Richard Nixon, in a tremendous article in Foreign Affairs just a few days ago, I think it's going to be published in a few days, said that he has for 5 years now been advocating annual summit meetings just because the summits sort of lead to a certain easing off of tensions. Looking at what has happened over the past couple of weeks, one would assume that he was talking of a different time. But it makes a lot of sense when he says that once you're preparing for a summit, you would hardly be trying to do anything which is clearly contrary to the interests of your partner at the next summit. I'm not talking of the ASAT test right now. I'm talking about Mr. Nixon's article. And I think that this getting acquainted and having a meeting at certain regular intervals, discussing the substantive differences between the two societies is maybe at least as important as coming up with some piece of paper which has to be signed and is being signed. I mean, you can sign papers on minor issues, can have them signed by the secretaries of state or by the respective members of cabinet. It doesn't require a summit. The summit, I think, should really go into the subjects of, as Mr. Reagan has said so very often, bringing down the suspicions which obviously exist on both sides of the line. And so it doesn't necessarily have to have a piece of paper at the very end.
Why now? There certainly were many other times when President Reagan, either in his last term, at the beginning of this term, could have gone over to the Soviet Union or met in Vienna or a neutral place and talked to either some of the other leaders. He could have gone to some of the funerals. Why the meeting now?
Well, you know that, you know the official statements on that as well as I do. He has suggested summits quite a few times. The Soviet leadership over the past years certainly was not very much in shape for taking a trip, traveling. You have, on the other hand, the standard rule that you have alternating sites. So you go to Moscow once, the next time it has to be Washington. So as a matter of fact, it would either have to be a neutral place like Geneva, or the next summit would have to be in the United States. Looking at Mr. Brezhnev, Mr. Andropov, Mr. Chernenko, they were unable to come over here on an extended trip. Why now? I think you have a young, comparatively young gentleman in the Soviet Union who is not restricted by any kind of primaries, by any kind of elections. So it is almost a safe bet to assume that we will have to deal with him, or the United States will have to deal with him, maybe even into the next century. So it's almost imperative to get to know this gentleman as early as possible.
Tulsa, Oklahoma, good morning. You're our first caller today. You have the Tulsa World with you.
I sure do, Carl, and there isn't a single thing in the Tulsa paper today about the spy story. It has been there for several days.
But just not today then, huh?
Today it's not there.
Is that a story? Have you been following it at all?
Been following it quite closely, yes.
What's your interest? Why follow it quite closely?
I was stationed in Germany several years ago in a very minor way. Was part of the security arrangement. Mm-hmm. And that's kind of what I wanted to ask your guest about. I get the impression, while we in this part of the world continue to talk about East Germany and West Germany in much the same sense that we're talking about China and Japan, I get the impression that there is a kind of loyalty between East Germany and West Germany that people in this part of the world don't understand. That is still one country with a culture that is identical. It's not two separate things. And I wonder if you can ever have the kind of security that we would have or identify in this part of the world, where you're talking about essentially one country, even though in this part of the world we identify it as two countries.
I very much agree with what you say when it comes to the identity of culture, and I mentioned before there is no language barrier, and there certainly are still family ties between East and West Germany. And it is certainly much easier for the East Germans, for example, to infiltrate West German security and the other way around. Now, if I look at what has transpired when it comes to espionage in other Western countries, I think that Germany is not standing in such a bad shape. We had the Walker case here in the United States just recently. You have the on and off spy cases in Great Britain, and there is no common border with any neighbor state which speaks the same language and has the same culture. So it might contribute to some of the cases, but I think they are by no means more severe than what we have seen in other countries as well.
Washington Post today has an article about the story you just referred to, the Walker spy case, and as you said, West Germany is not alone in having problems with spies. Michael Walker moved to prison in Virginia, accused spy working in dispensary. Ruth Marcus writes a story, and her lead paragraph says, accused spy Michael Lance Walker has been moved from a Maryland jail to a federal prison closer to his Norfolk home while awaiting trial on espionage charges, a prison spokesman said. Third paragraph, Walker is accused of giving his father, accused spy John Anthony Walker Jr., classified documents from the USS Nimitz, where the younger Walker served as a seaman until his arrest May 22nd. He is being held without bail until his trial, which will take place after his father trial, set to begin October 28th in Baltimore. What's the latest with this? Are we finding out that this particular spy case, the Walker and the family, the Walker family, is much worse than we initially had thought?
I wouldn't like to make any predictions whether it's worse or not. I can just go by what, on the one hand, comes out of the Pentagon and out of the government. Of course, they have to say it is a terrible spy case, and it even led to Secretary Weinberger asking for death penalty for spies in peacetime. I think it just is another nice example, not so nice, however you want to look at it, of the fact that espionage is going on all over the world, whether it is here in the United States, whether it is in West Germany, whether it's in Britain, in France. You will sometimes catch those guys, as it happens now here, and as maybe it might happen in East and West Germany these days. But probably 80 or 75 or 90% are just working their way around, whether they are sitting on top of a hill overlooking Washington, D.C., like the new Soviet embassy is doing now, or whether they are working in any capacity at consulates, at embassies, or just in the private industry. It has unfortunately become a way of life for all countries, West and East, to have within the contingent of their countrymen based abroad a very high percentage of people who are working for intelligence. And unfortunately, I'm afraid one has to live with that. And some of those cases blow. Okay.
Heinz Lohfeldt is our guest. He's a Washington correspondent with Der Spiegel magazine in West Germany. It is a weekly news magazine distributed around Europe. Phone lines are open for viewers in all areas of the country. If you have a question or a comment in your newspaper, we would certainly like to hear from you. Perhaps there is an editorial or an op-ed piece in your newspaper dealing with the upcoming summit, which will take place in Vienna between the United States and the Soviet Union. Perhaps there's some coverage of the spy case that's unfolding in Buenos Aires and also East and West Germany. If there's something in your newspaper and something you'd like to talk about, we'd like to hear from you. Those numbers are there at the bottom of your screen. Next call is from Sarasota, Florida. Good morning. Do you have the Herald Tribune with you today?
That's right.
And anything in there dealing with any of these issues?
And nothing about spy cases. It has been in the paper the last couple of days.
Have you been following it all?
And nothing following today's paper.
Have you been following it personally?
Well, yes, I been watching it, and I was a little upset that it happened, but I can see how easily it could happen with the language being the same and being the same people. I guess it would be very hard to detect.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Question or comment for our guest?
I have two questions for the guest. First up, wie geht es Ihnen? For your guest.
I didn't get you, I'm sorry.
Wie geht es Ihnen?
Oh, sehr gut, danke.
Is the Is the Spiegel considered a liberal or a conservative magazine?
If you want to put labels on it, it certainly is a liberal magazine.
All right, now the other question, sir.
Liberal in the good old European tradition, not liberal being a synonym for communist or leftish as it is being interpreted.
I would assume that was not so just by looking at you. And the other question is the German news media handling the South Africa situation with the same hysteria as the American news media?
I don't want to comment on the word hysteria. I only know that the European publications, dailies, weeklies, magazines, television, are covering South Africa very thoroughly. Most of the media do still have correspondents down in South Africa, and we have had a cover story in our magazine just a few weeks ago. Okay, let's say that in some editorials you will find a very outspoken criticism of the apartheid system. In other editorials you will also find some understanding for a rather cautious approach and for the attempt not to intervene too directly into the South African affairs. But one can say that in the majority of papers and also in television and radio, the call for economic sanctions has become rather prevalent.
Another story going on around the country. This is the Philadelphia Inquirer, and at the bottom of the page, on one side, we see a story that says, Greenpeace to sue France over ship. Steve Twalmy writes this story, Dateline Paris, and it says, Greenpeace vowed yesterday to sue France for the loss of a ship and a crew member in a covert attack in New Zealand last month, saying former White House lawyer Lloyd Cutler would lead the ecologist group's campaign in court, all but blaming France outright. Greenpeace chairman Dave McTaggart said that Cutler, who served under President Jimmy Carter, had offered his services without charge in seeking compensation for the sabotage of the Rainbow Warrior and the death of Fernando Perea. This case seems to suggest that the French Secret Service was involved in blowing up the Greenpeace ship, the Rainbow Warrior. Is this turning into a fairly major embarrassment for the Mitterrand government?
Yes, it certainly does. It already has, as a matter of fact. I mean, Monsieur Tricot, who was working very closely for Charles de Gaulle many, many years ago, has been issuing a report which, as he said himself, is certainly not the last answer to this case. He couldn't find any direct relations between the government on the one hand and what happened to the Rainbow Warrior, but he also in his report made it pretty clear that those people who sank that ship were certainly intelligence people, French intelligence people. Now the question is, did they act on their own, in their own interest or on their own spur of the moment, or did they have orders? Nobody will probably be able to trace orders to anybody within the government, but it has become a very severe issue for the Mitterrand government, which is facing parliamentary elections next year, and which is facing quite a few crises right now.
Phone lines are open for viewers in all areas of the country. We'd invite you to give us a call, get out your paper, and see if there's any articles dealing with this particular issue, or if you have a question or a comment on some of these, we would certainly like to hear from you. Just being the day before a Labor Day weekend, I have a feeling that some of our viewers are sleeping in a little later than normal, Mr. Lohfeldt. Certainly nothing.
I don't blame anybody,
certainly against you. I certainly wanted to sleep in today.
I would have loved to as well.
Editorial page of the Washington Post takes a stand on the whole Greenpeace issue and the involvement of France in the bombing of the Rainbow Warrior. Washington Post editorial writers say the Greenpeace affair, the first thing to say about the affair of the Greenpeace nuclear protest ship sunk by an explosion in New Zealand, in which a photographer on board was killed, is that for all the character of a crazy intrigue, it is not trivial or funny that a, quote, couple apprehended in a suspicious van were French intelligence agents, as were 3 other Frenchmen, all frogmen who disappeared from a suspicious second ship in the harbor, as was a 6th French citizen who somehow was aboard the Greenpeace ship itself. All this may may suggest the sort of thing you read about on the beach, but that reality is much graver. The last paragraph of the Washington Post editorial says, New Zealand has a healthier attitude. It is outraged. It is protesting to Paris, and it is holding 2 of the French spies on murder and arson charges and seeking the others. What sort of power does the New Zealand government actually have, do you think, in going against France in this? Even if they go after them, do you think France is really going to respond?
I think not. I mean, one has to keep in mind that the French, whenever it came to their force de frappe, which is their nuclear power, which a lot of people in Europe actually like to call farce de frappe because they call it, they don't consider it a really reasonable nuclear power. Whenever it comes to this topic, the French are reacting in a very adamant way. And I may remind you that before he was elected, Mr. Mitterrand promised that he was would sort of not abolish but stop this nuclear testing and everything. And it took him only 4 days to come around, because the nuclear armament for France is part of what France still considers its grandeur, its greatness. It has to be something which has to be done. And so they are probably going to be very adamant and not going to be influenced whether Mr. Lange, the Prime Minister of New Zealand, asked them to recall their ambassador or not.
Can you, if it's possible, taking a look at the way the French people look at these kinds of things, you being a West German, historically there have been some who would think that the French people can be very nationalistic in the sense of defending their own country and wanting other people to keep their noses out of their business. Here we have an ecological group which wanted to sail its ship in and interrupt what the French were doing, whether it was right or wrong, disturbing the government, and now we have governments like New Zealand criticizing them. The French people themselves, do you think they stick up for the government in this, or are they a little upset at what the government might have done?
They will certainly be upset and voice their being upset when it can be proven that there is a bit more of government involvement in this attack on that Greenpeace ship. Because as long as it comes to national pride, that's fine. But when it comes to actions like this, the French also have a very great feeling for justice. And this is certainly not a just thing which has been done there.
Clearwater, Florida, good morning. You're on the air. Go ahead, please.
Hi, Carl.
How are you today?
It's fine, thank you.
Thank you for calling. We appreciate it. Did you have a question or a comment this morning?
Yeah, and it's been bothering me a long time. I haven't heard a thing about it since I read it several weeks ago. And I'd like to ask your guest, it concerns the New York Times ad that was in the paper about the Soviet Union had taken out a 3/4 page ad against the United States. I'd like to know if that could ever happen in his country, that our staunchest enemy could take an ad out in their paper.
Could the Soviet Union then take an ad out in a West German newspaper?
Yeah, I haven't heard any protest about it, either in the paper since I read it or even on C-SPAN.
Does it bother you that the Soviet Union has done this?
It infuriates me. I can't believe we'd be so naive.
Mm-hmm. Do you think the New York Times should have refused to print the ad?
Absolutely.
Okay. Thanks for the call. What do you think?
Friends like that, who needs enemies?
Okay. Heinz Lohfeldt, what do you think?
Well, you have a conflict here. You have either to decide that you're absolutely in favor of the kind of society we are living in, and I love this kind of society we are living in. Then you have to give everybody and his brother the possibility, as long as he pays for it, to put in an ad into the New York Times and the Washington Post. Of course, if the ad would be by any means asking for criminal action or whatsoever, then the paper should deny to accept it. But if it is just a statement of opinion, you find so many statements of opinion, not only in the Washington Post or in the New York Times, but in a lot of newspapers, be it by the Shah's family of Iran, be it by Khomeini's people. Everybody is who has the money comes up with a full-page, half-page, 3/4 ad. And as I said, as long as it doesn't ask for any criminal action which would violate any laws, the papers living in the kind of society of a free market where they have to sell their product, they accept them, and I cannot blame them for it. because otherwise you come to a kind of censorship. Where do you draw the line? Do you say if a democratic group wants to push forward its opinion in an ad, and this opinion is conflicting with the opinion of the editorial staff of that paper, you don't accept the ad? You come into a kind of censorship which is very dangerous.
Is this an example of the Soviet Union, basically almost a public relations campaign, preparing its case for these talks to take place in Vienna?
Well, look, the Soviet Union has been on a public relations campaign for years now. The first one obviously failed. It was the public relations campaign in Western Europe, in particular in West Germany, against the deployment of Pershings and cruise missiles. We had these so-called hot summers and hot falls over there. It fails. Now they are starting a second one, have started a second one. Main topic is SDI, and of course that is their jockeying for position for the summit in Geneva. They are trying with their public relation campaign to influence world opinion, in particular European opinion again.
Looking once again at the spy scandal, at least that's what the New York Times calls it, taking place in West Germany. Once again, the James Markham story about what's taking place there. And I moved to the very end of the story, and there's kind of an interesting twist to this whole story about what's taking place with spies moving back and forth across the West and East German border. At the very bottom of his article it says, in another development, the British police were reported to be investigating the possibility that a bogus death notice printed in the Times of London could have been a coded message to East German agents in Britain warning them to take cover because of Mr. Teage's defection. I'm going to drop the New York Times, and this is the Richmond Times Dispatch. They have a similar story. It says East German goes west, link to scandal is denied. It's a New York Times service story. But they have a blown up picture down here at the bottom of the actual obituary column. And this is the purported death notice was printed in the Times of London on Saturday. Any comment at all on this?
Haven't newspapers all over the world been used for this kind of ads for I don't know how many years, in order for intelligence communities to get in touch with their people, and also for many, many other things of that kind?
Interesting twist as we look at journalism, another one of the many uses of newspapers.
And how would you know? I mean, if you or I go and place this kind of ad in any of our neighborhood newspapers, how should that poor girl or the poor gentleman who takes the classified ad know that this is a bogus ad, that this guy really is not there, that he doesn't even exist? How would they know?
And that it's a spy signal from one to the other. Akron, Ohio, good morning. You have the Beacon Journal with you today?
Yes, I do, and you wouldn't be interested. There's nothing about your guest or about West Germany.
Okay, I'll take your word for it. Do you have a question or a comment?
Yes, I do. I'd like to ask your guest, in his opinion, does he think that anything that the Soviets say publicly is intended for the West German audience or the American audience instead of the governments?
Oh yeah, definitely. I see a big difference. I was thinking and talking about that yesterday to some friends of mine, in how, for example, the Soviet Union and the United States approached this summit in Geneva. And I'm not talking about the speech of Mr. McFarlane or the ASAT test, but just the approach. The Soviet approach very obviously is aimed at public opinion. Worldwide, number one, but West Europe in particular, in order to create a certain negative feeling about the approach of the United States. The Soviets try to portray themselves, we all have seen that over generations now, as the one and only peace-loving nation, and try to portray the United States government, not the people, they make that distinction there, as cold warriors and whatever. The United States government, on the other hand, seems to take the attitude that it doesn't have to prove or to impress anybody with the fact that it is peace-loving, because this is a well-established fact. And so it just goes down matter of fact to whatever is on the agenda and say, well, we have to do this, this, this. And we even do start a test, an ASAT, an anti-satellite test, right before the summit starts. One can certainly argue whether this is the right approach in order to influence world opinion, but maybe it's not even intended to.
The next step in the spy dust story appears in the newspapers today. This is the Richmond Times-Dispatch of this Friday, August 30th, and it says 2 weeks of, quote, spy dust tests likely. It's put together by Wire Dispatches, and it says a team of investigators from the United States said in Moscow yesterday that they plan to spend up to 2 weeks studying purported Soviet use of chemical dust to track resident Americans. Briefing U.S. residents, the 4 members of the team said they intended to take samples from the homes, offices, and cars of representative groups of diplomats, journalists, and other Americans in Moscow and Leningrad. There were some that would say, that have said, that the release of information about the spy dust use by the Soviets, something almost planned on the part of the U.S. State Department to somehow embarrass the Soviet government before these arms talks or this summit begins. Do you think that's true?
Let's put it this way, it certainly came in handy. It certainly came in handy. I mean, it took a lot of uproar from the debate about this planned anti-satellite test, and one can argue whether it was published and reported at that time intentionally in order to outweigh the other debate or not. I doubt it. I think it just came in handy.
Newsweek, or excuse me, Time magazine this week prints an editorial cartoon, this one by Mr. Bassett with the Seattle Times. And if you take a look, it appears as if it's a drawing of downtown Moscow in a telephone booth. And an agent is coming out of the telephone booth, and he's looking at a figure that looks like Tinkerbell on his hand, saying, "Nice work, Agent Tinker Belinsky." And on the other side, Dust Up in Moscow, the story about the U.S. takes a hard line with the Soviets, talking about the whole issue of the use of this spy dust. Story in Time magazine this week. Phone lines are open for viewers in all areas of the country. I'd like to get your comment on some of these issues. If you've got an article in your morning newspaper, we'd certainly be interested in hearing from you, hear what you have got to say. Give us a call, perhaps, if something in your newspaper, an editorial or an op-ed piece, something that's interested you, even if it was from perhaps a newspaper from another day. Moving to a completely different subject, oftentimes, Mr. Lohfeldt, this program deals with journalism and what goes on, and we talk about some of the comings and goings of newspapers and magazines. This is the Philadelphia Inquirer, and there's been an ongoing story about whether or not the Evening News Association, which owns the Detroit News, would be sold, or if they would actually allow themselves to be bought by another company. Philadelphia Inquirer is a Knight Ridder paper, and they own the other paper in Detroit, which is the Detroit Free Press. But they write this story, Gannett agrees to buy Detroit News. And if I move to the very middle of the article, put together by our Inquirer Wire Services, it says, Wall Street observers have been speculating that whoever bought ENA, the Evening News Association, would quickly move to try and end the fierce newspaper rivalry between the Detroit News and Detroit Free Press. The two newspapers, both of which have been losing money for years, could be partially merged in a joint operating agreement with one entity handling business and production while continuing to publish 2 separate editorial products. Knight Ridder Newspapers Incorporated, publisher of the Detroit Free Press and 28 other daily newspapers, including the Philadelphia Inquirer and Daily News, would welcome such an agreement. Company officials have said Knight Ridder operates under such a joint agreement in Miami, where 2 newspapers, one owned by Cox Communications Incorporated of Atlanta, are both published by a Knight Ridder subsidiary. Story in the Philadelphia Inquirer, there's probably a pretty good chance that you'll find an article about Gannett purchasing the Evening News Association, or a story about the Detroit News in your newspaper. We'd certainly like to hear from you. Birmingham, Alabama, good morning, you're on the air. Go ahead, please.
Yes, I just had a couple of general interest questions about your magazine and how you cover the United States, whether the press corps in Germany is as aggressive as the press corps in America, and just really what type of articles you might cover. Are you on a every time do you have an article? And also another question about the disarmament movement in Germany. I haven't heard much about it. I was just wondering whether it comes and goes or whether it'll pick back up as the talks pick up, or just general questions like that.
Okay, let me just answer the first one. I think there are a few journalists in West Germany or in Western Europe who are certainly as aggressive as a few journalists in this country, because I do not think that the journalists in this country in general are that aggressive. There are quite a number, and those are the ones you see very often and you hear about most of the time. When it comes to what I'm writing, I'm basically covering politics, American politics, and that means, on the one hand, domestic politics campaigns and so on, and on the other hand, everything which one way or another is related to international, to world, to European affairs. And that also answers the question, or I could answer the question with that link on the disarmament movement I mentioned before, that the Soviets started their propaganda campaign against the deployment of Pershing and crews. And you might hear from the peace or disarmament movement again very shortly, in case nothing really substantial comes out of the Geneva arms talks, not so much of the summit, but of the arms talks, when there might be a new movement trying to protest very strongly against the SDI component.
Manhattan, New York, your next caller. Go ahead, please.
Good morning.
Good morning.
I was wondering, when we read a piece of information that's attributed to such and such a Kremlin official, is that released as public relations, some kind of press release, or does that come as the same general information that the Soviet people get?
I think a lot of people, a lot of news items and information we get here are not even published in the Soviet papers or on Soviet television and radio. So that would already answer the question, that they try to get out some points which they think might be of some interest or some value for their public relations campaign in the West, and which are either never ever or only with a big delay printed in the Soviet media.
Manhattan, New York, thanks for the call. Phone lines are open. If you have a question or comment, please feel free to give us a call. One of the things in opening up the show you said you cover here in Washington is presidential campaigns and what's going on. This is the Washington Times for this Friday morning. They have a little morning bulletin column that says Inside the Beltway, meaning Washington, and a little picture of the Reverend M.G. Pat Robertson. It says Pat for Prez. Richard Viguerie, who has sold Conservative Digest and is stepping down as publisher with this August edition, devotes his farewell cover to conservative Christian fundamentalist radio broadcaster, the Reverend M.G. Pat Robertson. Why? Because Pat Robertson may run for president in 1988. One of the nuances of what's becoming a campaign for the presidency. Would you write an article about, let's say, for instance, suggestions that TV evangelist Pat Robertson might run for president? Would that be something that you might write about?
We did have a rather long story on Robinson many, many years ago, which one of my predecessors did. I think I would only touch this issue when it really becomes a serious issue. I think as of today, I would not take that presidential bid too serious.
Do you write a great deal? Do you and other West German journalists write a great deal about U.S. politics, meaning who's going to run, whether it's Hart or Dole or something like that?
Unfortunately, we have to, because there is a big interest in that issue, and you always have to explain this very complicated system. I mean, how do you explain a primary? Okay, I have my standard story now, which I wrote somewhere back in 1968, so I just pull it out every time something like that comes up, every 4 years, in other words. But it is a somewhat complicated affair to explain the whole electoral system to a European reader.
There are probably some American journalists who also would say that, unfortunately, they have to cover the presidential campaigns. Riverside, California, you're our next caller. Go ahead, please.
Yes, sir. I have a question for your guest.
Go ahead.
Do you see in the foreseeable future a reunification of Germany?
I'm afraid I have to say no. Very clear answer. I cannot see it.
Is that something that's talked about at all in West Germany?
It is talked about in some of the media. It is talked about in some of the foundations and circles who are getting smaller and smaller, interestingly enough, by the year, which are still saying that this is part of our constitution, that we have to strive for reunification. But the generation of my own age, and of course even those who are much, much, much younger, talk about it less and less. So I just cannot see it in the foreseeable future.
Talk a lot about politics here on C-SPAN, and a lot about governors as well. This is USA Today I'm holding up. It's page 3A section, all the way down in this corner, way down here. Interesting story, and it also deals with newspapers, which is what we talk about here. Governor Cuomo chided by a New Hampshire paper, Dateline Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, quote, "Welcome, Northeast governors, even you, Mario," said the headline Thursday atop the Manchester Union Leader. The dig by the conservative newspaper was its latest barb at New York Governor Mario Cuomo, cited as a 1988 Democratic presidential hopeful. Cuomo earlier snubbed the paper, asking for then canceling a meeting with editors after they branded him a dulcet humbug and a plier of gooey verbal ooze, is what the Manchester Union Leader had to say about Governor Mario Cuomo. Read any articles about Governor Mario Cuomo's possible campaign for the presidency?
That's going to come, certainly, and we covered him, of course. I had to do that when he was in San Francisco and gave that rhetorically and oratorically splendid speech. I would, however, not do even 20 lines about the Manchester Union Leader, because you can follow that back for, I don't know, 20, 25 years. Whenever they see a chance to get headlines for themselves, they do it. Whether it was with Muskie in the 1972 campaign or any other candidates, I wouldn't give them a line.
Calling Manchester Union Leader calling Governor Cuomo a dulcet humbug and a plier of gooey verbal ooze. What do you think of saying something like that about the New York governor?
As I said, I wouldn't even comment on the Manchester Union Leader. I think that's like making or taking the Bild Zeitung, which you mentioned before, as representative for the German press and media.
Oak Ridge, Tennessee. Good morning. Go ahead, please.
Good morning.
Morning.
I would like to ask your guest what the general feeling of the East Germans are toward their government, and is there a large or even medium body of favorable attitude in the West German people toward the East German government? You know, with all this peace stuff, it seems like everything, and I've really the same thing with the former Prime Minister. I forget his name.
Okay.
After Willy Brandt, who was it?
That was Helmut Schmidt. After Willy Brandt was Helmut Schmidt. Now, the feelings of the East Germans towards their government, of course, I can hardly give any kind of statement on that. Number one, they don't have any Poles over there. You don't find any Poles in any communist country, of course not, for reasons which are obvious. One thing, however, is certain, and this is why I answered one other question about the possibilities of a German reunification in a negative way. You have a change of generations in East Germany as well, and the vast majority of the people living there now has been born into that communist society. They have never known any unified Germany. They still speak the same language, but they have grown up in that communist society, which does not mean that they love their government, by no means. And I cannot see any kind of substantial favorable attitude within West Germany towards the East German government. The word party is already an exaggeration. The little groupings which try to sort of bring forward the ideas of the East German government within West Germany, whenever they face any kind of election, they get maybe 0.01% of the vote, or what have you, nothing more.
Heinz Lohfeldt is a Washington correspondent with Der Spiegel magazine. Der Spiegel is a news magazine, a weekly news magazine printed in West Germany. Next call is from Edison, New Jersey. You're on the air. Go ahead, please.
Hi. First of all, your program is fantastic.
Well, thanks for watching.
My question is, a few days ago, I read in the paper that the Russians have a big fleet up at the North Pole. Then today, in the Star Ledger, there was a little article that NATO has a thing called Safari, where the ships, are going to meet in Iceland, and they're going to have maneuvers and all this. Does your guest know anything about this?
No, not about these two specific events. I'm sorry about that.
Well, thank you anyway. I have a son up in Iceland. That's why I'm so interested.
I see. Okay. I'm going to try to find it. There is an article, caller, and you brought up a story that I was going to ask about. You caught me a little off guard here, but there's a story in the newspaper today about a fleet of ships. Basically, it's NATO maneuvers that are moving out of Boston, is the way the story reads, and they are headed for Iceland, and it talks about some of the joint operations that go on between the United States and NATO countries. Are there a lot of those kinds of maneuvers, and are they important to West Germany?
Well, I mean, the maneuvers of NATO have a history which is almost as long as old as NATO. That's the idea of a defense arrangement, that you do have maneuvers once in a while. You cannot just live by the paper the contract is written on. You have to somehow substantiate the contract, and in order to see whether an alliance of this kind under real circumstances would be able to work, you have to do maneuvers. That's unfortunate as all armament is, but it has to be done. And the Germans take part, and all other NATO countries, sometimes without the Greeks, sometimes without the French, but it is taken serious, of course, seriously.
San Antonio, Texas, you're our next caller. Go ahead, please.
Yes, let me turn my TV down.
Okay, that'll get rid of the echo.
Yes. I have a question about the politics in your own country, Germany. When our president went over there to the Bitburg Cemetery, did that help Mr. Kohl or hurt him?
The final visit, I went over there as well with the presidential press plane from here. The final visit eventually helped Mr. Kohl. But what happened in the weeks and months before that visit certainly damaged his own standing within Germany, because he had been pushing for that visit and for a demonstration of reconciliation, which in my humble opinion was absolutely blown out of proportion, because the president wouldn't have come over there to Germany altogether if there hadn't been reconciliation going on for 40 years.
Second question, San Antonio?
No, I just think that a lot of people over here admire Mr. Kohl, and we did hope that all our president went through did help him. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the call. I cannot find the story, but somewhere in the Washington Post today, there is a story about the maneuvers that are taking place out of Boston. Unfortunately, our show's almost over, or someone from Boston could call us and tell us what the Globe has to say about it. But the story basically says that these maneuvers, they're taking off on Operation Safari is what it's called, and they're moving out, and that even as they're beginning these maneuvers with submarines and destroyers and whatnot, that the U.S. government knows there is a Soviet spy ship following them along the way. Pretty common.
What else is new? Whenever there's any East Bloc Warsaw Pact maneuver, you can be sure that there are some American spy ships or Western spy ships nearby, that there are American airplanes, that there are American satellites nearby. So we are sort of turning back to where we started. This is the game in the town these days. If the one side does something, the other one watches, and the other way around.
Is it almost a game we play with each other as superpowers?
Yes, I'd say so.
Is it something that you are called to write about every once in a while?
Every once in a while. Not so much since I have been back to this country over the past 2 years and a few months, but
as a West German journalist, do you enjoy covering Washington?
Yes, I love it.
Last call for the day is from Oklahoma City, Oklahoma. You're on the air. Go ahead, please.
Yes, the gentleman that is your guest there earlier was referring to the peace movement in West Germany that we heard so much about a little while ago, and mentioned that we may be hearing more about it, and that it was perhaps inspired by the Soviets. And I think the people here in America are a little naive about that. They think that so many of them think that it is a genuine peace movement. If it is, in fact, inspired by the Soviets, why are we not more enlightened about it here in the United States? And also, I guess the second question, is it possible that more European papers could be available here in the United States? If they are, where can we get them?
The second question is hard for me to answer. That's a matter of distribution. They usually come in via New York, and then it takes its while for them to get to all over the country. I remember an experience myself trying to get my own magazine somewhere in the West. I don't want to mention the city, and the one I found was 5 weeks old. So that is something I cannot talk about. But to the first question you posed regarding the peace movement, I want to make it clear, I did not say, and I will not say, that the peace movement in Western Europe or in Germany is inspired by the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union are really nice fellow travelers once the peace movement is there, because you may be sure that the vast majority of those people are really concerned about peace and war, because they have had war on their territory so very often. But the Soviets like to exploit these movements, that's for sure.
Our guest for the last hour has been Heinz Lohfeldt, Washington correspondent with Der Spiegel magazine. Der Spiegel is not printed in English, is that correct?
No, it's not.
But if someone wanted to get it here in the United States, how would they find a copy?
There is a company in New Jersey which is called German Language Publications. I think it's in Englewood, and they take subscriptions. And of course in the big cities, in big newsstands and hotels, you can actually get it. In New York, I understand you get it as of Monday, 12 noon.
Mr. Lohfeldt has been with the Der Spiegel magazine since 1960 and has been in Washington on and off for about 7 years. Mr. Lohfeldt, thank you very much for joining us for the past hour. Those of you who have been calling and watching, we appreciate it. Have a nice Friday and a nice Labor Day weekend.